Battle in the Minefields is the name of a book that I published last year in 2019 with the University of Chicago Press that I co-wrote with a friend and colleague, Bernard Lax, of the University of Paris. Battle in the Minefields is a story about rupture and continuity, both intellectually and socially or professionally or individually. That is to say, we study the ideas, and at the same time we study the people and the groups that were involved in these minefields. And when I talk about the minefields, I primarily mean linguistics, psychology, philosophy, and logic. So our goal is to give you, the reader, an understanding of how we got to where we are today in linguistics in particular and in these neighboring disciplines. The book actually had its origins in conversations that Bernard Lax and I had starting in the 1990s, so about 25 years ago. And we perceived at the time that we, like essentially all of our colleagues, were not as well informed about the origins and the significance of the ideas that we knew of in linguistics, and we felt that in particular we were not well informed about the relationship between our field and some of the neighboring fields. And we began to look into this, and as we did, our project grew and grew. We realized around 2006 that we had a book that we wanted to write, and it too grew and grew. And around 2015 we said, well, we're going to cut back on this for the first volume, which ended up being Battle in the Minefields. And we tell the story up to World War II, this period at the end of the 1930s when everything changed in the Western world. So what I'd like to do is explain to you something of the structure of the book and explain how we consider both rupture and continuity in the field of ideas and in the individual and social fields that define us and who we are and what we do. The book itself is divided into 10 chapters. The first and the 10th are an introduction and a small set of conclusions. The book focuses on the 20th century, so our chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 are about the 20th century. But in order to understand what was going on in the 20th century, we need some background. And so chapters 2, 3, and 4 are an introduction to some of the important developments in linguistics, psychology, and philosophy in the 19th century. We'll take just a little bit of a look at this in just a moment. Chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 involve these disciplines that I mentioned. So I'm going to show you a big poster that I've put together, in fact. And this poster is an amalgam of the large number of diagrams that we've got within the book. There are enough people here that you may not have heard of, or if you have, you don't know exactly how they fit into the larger intellectual fabric that we're looking at, that we've created a number of diagrams. And the poster that I'm about to show you tries to put them all together to give you a kind of a panoramic view of who it is that we're looking at. So that's where we are. I'm going to show you the poster next, and then I'm going to break it down into the diagrams that actually form part of the book itself. Let's take a look then at this poster. You see a bunch of boxes. Almost all of the boxes represent people whose names are given there. I've indicated also the years they were born, the years they died. And so their vertical position on the graph is determined entirely by when they were born. People who were born earlier are at the bottom. Time goes up. People who were born later are at the top. So if you look at the people towards the top, you can see that they were born in the early years of the 20th century. Go down to the bottom, and you have people who were born at the end of the 18th century, 17 something or other. Left to right, however, is organized in a way to make their disciplinary connections clearer. Over on the left, where we see these yellow ovals and gold-colored rectangles, these are linguists. The gold-colored rectangles in general are linguists. In the middle, we've got philosophers, and on the right, the boxes are in blue, are psychologists. Of course, as you can well imagine, over the course of this history, there are a lot of people who were doing more than one thing, or a lot of people who were doing both philosophy and psychology. So we've had to jiggle a little bit in order to give appropriate colors to each of these people. But there are a lot of people here. All of them are now familiar to us, but we recognize that some of them weren't familiar to us before. So let's take a look at some of the detail in the chart. Naturally, linguistics was the first discipline that we wanted to look at. And we're aware that a lot of our colleagues, and certainly a lot of people outside of linguistics, think of linguistics as a rather young field, but we knew perfectly well that nothing could be farther from the truth. And as we went back and looked at the history of linguistics, of modern linguistics, we came to see that linguistics was in fact one of the most important disciplines in the modern university. The modern university was basically created in Germany, in Prussia originally. And linguistics throughout the 19th century played an important role. It had interacted with neighboring fields in many and important ways. So we decided to drill down and take a look at the history of linguistics to see what it could tell us about who we are today and how we got to where we are. And as we looked at it, we began to see that it coalesced in a small number of generations. So let's take a look at this poster and see what it can tell us about the generational structure of linguistics. And we're going to take this focusing now on the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Let's take a look. It's quite interesting. Let's look at the first three generations of modern linguists. So the first generation includes Humboldt and Schlegel and Grimm and Rask and Bopp. These were people who learned their linguistics by studying the languages themselves. Well, there's one big exception to that, and that is the people who were studying Sanskrit had access to the great insights of the traditional Sanskrit grammarians, such as Panini. So that's a huge exception to this statement that I can make otherwise, which is that people, the linguists of this generation, learn their linguistics by directly studying the languages. I should say that in these diagrams that we're looking at here, the blue lines, and most of the lines that connect linguists here are blue, those indicate the teacher-student relationship. So you can see that the people in this first generation, for the most part, learned their linguistics without having a teacher to teach them linguistics, which is the point here. The second generation of linguists included such people as Hermann Grassmann and Lepsius and Curtius, Schleicher, and also William Dwight Whitney, a very important American linguist whose writings would influence the next generation of linguists, and then some. The third generation of linguists brings us to a point where things begin to become familiar to us. We can go back, we can read the work of people writing in this third generation and understand what they're getting at and how they're thinking. The third generation included the neo-grammarians, and with the rise of the neo-grammarians, a couple things happened. First of all, we had our first internecine struggles, that is, our first intellectual struggles within the discipline of linguistics. But we also have very influential linguists such as Baudouin de Courtenay, who I would say basically invented modern phonology. The neo-grammarians were a group of linguists who were centered at the university in Leipzig in the 1870s. This was the same moment that Wundt was setting up his experimental psychology group at the University of Leipzig. So there was a lot of interaction between psychology and linguistics at this point. And there was a big change that the neo-grammarians brought to the study of linguistics. That was, they looked at language and they said, yes, linguistics is the study of language, and language is what individuals do. Psychology is the study of the individual mind, and if we want to understand how speakers spoke in the past, because linguistics at this point was essentially, all of it was essentially historical linguistics, and the neo-grammarians said, if we want to understand the mind of the speaker in the past, the best way to understand that is to study the mind of speakers today. So there wasn't a sense among neo-grammarians, as there had been in previous generations, that there was a direction of change, either improvement or a decline in the character of language. The neo-grammarians said, no, language is qualitatively the same over time because language is the creation of individual speakers. Okay, so this gives us a sense of the first three generations. I'll turn to the fourth generation in a little bit. I'm going to first turn and look at philosophers and psychologists in the 19th century. A good way to summarize the material on philosophy and psychology in the late 19th century would be to focus just on two groups of people, Brentano and his students, and Wilhelm Wundt and his students. Both of them were both philosophers and psychologists. Brentano is more remembered as a philosopher, and Wundt is more remembered as a psychologist, but both felt that they were doing both. Let's take a brief look at Brentano. Here I've indicated a number of the people who Brentano greatly influenced, people who were students of his. So, for example, Tomáš Masaryk, who was the first president of the country of Czechoslovakia after World War I, plays an important role here, actually for two reasons. Because, first of all, he brought Edmund Husserl to Brentano, convinced Husserl to come and become a student of Brentano's. And second of all, in his capacity as a teacher of Mathesius was the faculty member who got the Prague Linguistics Circle going, working along with Roman Jakobson. Other important people, Christian von Ehrenfeld was the psychologist whose students created Gestalt psychology. I mentioned Edmund Husserl, an important philosopher that we'll spend more time with in our 20th century chapter on phonology. Kazimierz Twardowski, who was a Polish logician, was very important in the development of Polish logic, which in turn played an important role in the development of categorical grammar and formal grammars more generally in the United States. Sigmund Freud, you know who he was. Karl Stumpf was a very important psychologist who developed ideas and methods that were extremely important in the development of phonetics. And Jakobson cites him quite a bit in his European period. Okay, just gives you a sense of Brentano. Wundt actually had a lab in which he created large numbers of experimental psychologists. Many of them were people who had come from the United States to study with him, like G. Stanley Hall. We've got the names here of several people who will play a role in the development of American psychology. I mentioned G. Stanley Hall, but also James McKean Cattell at Columbia University, and James Angel, and Edward Titchener. So these are some important names. As you'll see here, Roman Jakobson is in this genealogical tree. Gustav Speth was one of his teachers when he was an undergrad at the University of Moscow. Anyway, a very quick overview of some of what was going on at the end of the 19th century. That'll be important as we move now into the 20th century. The two most important linguists in the period that we're looking at, which is to say the 20th century before World War II, the two most important linguists, American linguists during this period, were Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield. And you would have to search really far and wide to find two linguists who were more different. I think that people today tend to forget that. Edward Sapir was a little bit older than Leonard Bloomfield. Sapir was born in 1884. He was a immigrant from Central Europe. He grew up in New York. He did his undergraduate studies and his graduate studies as well at Columbia University. And it was there that he encountered Franz Boas. Boas was German-born who spent his entire career in the United States and created anthropology as we know it today in the United States. Sapir, as I say, was one of his students. He spent the first 15 years or so of his professional life at what's today the Canadian Museum of Civilization. He created an anthropology section of it, and so he spent the first 15 years of his professional career as a PhD outside of academia. He wanted to get back into academia, and in 1925 he was offered a position as a professor at the University of Chicago. He spent several years there, and in the early 1930s, he moved to Yale University. He rather tragically had a heart attack in 1937 at the Linguistics Institute, in fact, and he passed away in 1939. He had a number of students who were very important and influential, and many of them continued his ideas. He was a very charismatic man, and he was very interested in the mind and in culture and in poetry, and his conception of phonology was quite different from that of Leonard Bloomfield, who we'll get to in a moment. And there are many respects in which there's a direct line between the kind of phonology that Sapir supported and developed, and that of Zellick-Harris, and that of generative phonology. We'll be talking about that in times to come. Sapir, as I say, had a number of students. Three of his students, who were not literally his students in the sense of having him as their academic advisor, were Benjamin Lee Whorf of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, Kenneth Pike, and Zellick-Harris. Zellick-Harris is the most important and creative linguist of his generation, the next generation after Sapir. Sapir also had several students who were very influential, students who got their PhD under his advising. One was Charles Hockett, one was Mary Haas, another was Stanley Newman, and another was Morris Swadesh. Let's turn now to Leonard Bloomfield briefly. Leonard Bloomfield was just 3 years younger than Edward Sapir. He was born in 1887. His parents had recently immigrated from Germany. They were German Jews. They spoke German at home, and they lived on the south side of Chicago, which is actually not far from where I live now. But when Bloomfield was still a boy, they moved to a northern suburb. They moved up to Wisconsin, and Bloomfield's parents ran a resort hotel, essentially. Bloomfield's career went through several chapters, as we call them in the book. He began, first he did his studies. He was an undergrad at Harvard. He did a master's degree at University of Wisconsin. He did a PhD in Indo-European linguistics at the University of Chicago, where he was the student of Karl Buck. After that, he became an assistant professor of linguistics. He was, for a while, at the University of Illinois. For a little while, he was at Ohio State University. And then he came back to the University of Chicago. During this first part of his career, up until the time that he was at Ohio State, he was interested in Wundtian psychology. And in fact, while he was still an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, he went to Germany for a year, a sabbatical year, and there he sat in on courses that Wundt was teaching. And it seems reasonably clear at this point that some of the basic ideas of immediate constituent structure that Bloomfield developed in the United States was derived from ideas that Wilhelm Wundt was discussing in his courses on logic and thought. Bloomfield, as I say, was a Wundtian early in his career. I should mention, too, that Bloomfield's decision to spend a year essentially as a postdoc in Germany was not in any sense either an accident or related to the fact that his family had its roots in Germany, but rather due to the fact that in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, it was pretty much the norm that American academics in many fields had to go to Germany to do a postdoc if they hadn't done their PhD there, because Germany was basically where it's at from an academic point of view. Nowadays, the United States plays that role in many regards, but it was Germany back in Bloomfield's day. So Bloomfield, as I say, was a Wundtian in his early years as a linguist. When he was at Ohio State, he switched gears, so to speak, and became a behaviorist. And behaviorism is something that we're going to be talking about when we look at psychologists in the 20th century. But he became very much a confirmed behaviorist and decided that in the study of language, there was no more room for talking about the mind or thoughts, that the focus should instead be on behavior. And Bloomfield came to the University of Chicago, and while he was at Chicago, he wrote a book called Language, which had a greater impact on the way linguistics developed in the United States than perhaps any other book. It was a linguistics that was in many ways austere and behavior oriented. Towards the end of his career, he wrote a paper. It was published in 1939. It's called Menominee Morphophonemics, and it was published in essentially a Festschrift or a memorial volume in basically the journal of the Prague Linguistics Circle. And in this short paper, he goes to Menominee Morphophonemics. He studies Menominee as a Native American language spoken in Wisconsin, in fact, not far from where Bloomfield grew up. And Bloomfield studies Menominee Morphophonemics and comes up with an analysis which is very modern in many respects and very Sapirian as well. It very much has a dynamic character in which one segment turns into another segment, and that there are something that today we would call underlying segments or morphemes, which then are concatenated in the formation of words. And then there is a sequence of principles or rules which apply in a particular order, and after they're all done applying, what we find is the surface form. So in some respects, it seems like Bloomfield in this final paper was going back to his early studies, perhaps not just going back to Wundt, but going back to the Paninian approach to morphology and to phonemics. In any event, Bloomfield continued to have a great influence on the field even after his death, and that was largely through his writings, and when I say his writings, by far the most important was his book Language, which was published in 1933. As charismatic as Sapir was, Bloomfield was not. He had very few students. He didn't really seem to like reaching out to people, and so his influence was through his writing. There are a couple people who felt that they were his students in a certain respect, and I think it would be fair to include Zelig Harris under that description, and certainly Kenneth Pike, and Charles Hockett as well. But he never really created a circle of students around him that had its own character. So Bloomfield, as I say, was a professor at the University of Chicago for quite a while, starting in the 1920s. At the end of the 1930s, about a year after Sapir died, Yale made an offer to Bloomfield, who was at Chicago, and Bloomfield accepted the offer, and he moved to New Haven, where Yale University is found. And he spent the World War II years there. Tragically, he had a very bad stroke in 1946, and he died 3 years later in 1949. Chapter 5 is about the development of psychology in the United States as well as in France and Germany. Much of the development in the United States can be understood as a transplantation, so to speak, of the work of Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt was a professor at Leipzig, as I mentioned earlier. And Wundt had a large number of students who earned their PhDs in his laboratory over a couple of decades. Many of these were Americans who then came to the United States and developed departments of psychology here. We could include among those Edward Titchener, who himself was British, but he came to the United States and he developed what was arguably the most influential department of psychology at that time at Cornell University. There are people like G. Stanley Hall, who played an important role in a number of ways, who studied with Wundt, James Cattell at Columbia, James Angell at University of Chicago. The development of psychology, as we know in the United States, grew out of Wundt's ideas about experimental psychology. And in many ways, psychology can be understood through its methods as much as it can through the questions that it tries to answer. This kind of psychology found itself confronted by another view, which grew out of the pragmatic view that was certainly very American and can easily be associated with such people as William James at Harvard and Charles Sanders Peirce, who was for a certain brief period at Johns Hopkins University. And the functionalist approach is, as they say, heavily influenced by pragmatism, all of which is to say this is a view of the mind or the organism more generally, as an organism that's in the world and needs to solve problems. So in a certain respect, this kind of psychology and this kind of philosophy, pragmatism, is the child of Darwinian thought going back to the 1860s, 70s, 80s in England and eventually elsewhere. So this functionalism focuses not on what a person can introspect and see going on in their own mind, but rather looking at organisms, and primarily now people, looking at how people solve problems in a particular way, either life problems or problems that are posed to them as subjects in a psychology laboratory. Well, as a response partly to functionalism, but perhaps even more to structuralism, behaviorism arose at the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, around 1912, 1913. By the end of the teens, it was a very, very much a going concern. And behaviorism strikes us in many ways as antedated, and yet it has its impact, it has its effects on us today. We still, certainly in linguistics and in many of the minefields, we in linguistics do not find ourselves open to talking about subjectivity or what the thoughts are that a speaker has. If we're going to include meaning, it's going to be a very austere kind of meaning, a meaning that develops out of a symbolic logic with perhaps a temporal logic to it, perhaps. But it's not. There's no room for subjectivity, certainly in generative grammar. I can't say in linguistics as a whole. Certainly there are some parts, for example, Susumu Kuno's work or Nicolas Ruet's or Wally Chaffe's. There's certainly approaches to some kinds of linguistics in which subjectivity can play a role, but that's very much not at the center of what, for example, generative grammar would include in its purview. Okay, and then the fourth school of psychology that plays a very important role is the Gestalt psychology, which, again, comes from Germany and would play an important role in challenging behaviorism as an adequate way of looking at the human mind and understanding how the mind works. Chapter 7 has to do with philosophy in the period of 1900 to 1940, and with all the other materials that we discuss. The choices that we make for who we're going to focus on really are made not by looking at who was the most cited in this period, but rather which work was most important for us to understand as we look back from where we are today. And from that point of view, the two most important philosophical movements are, first of all, the work of Edmund Husserl, and second of all, the work of the logical positivists and logical empiricists. Now the second, basically the Vienna Circle and their co-workers, I've discussed in considerable detail in a couple of recent YouTube videos, so I'm not going to say much about them here or now. But on Husserl, I should say something. Lax and I were not particularly familiar with Husserl's work, and certainly not with his importance, before we began work on this project. But it was through reading the work of people like Roman Jakobson and then basically other Europeans writing in the period from 1910 to 1940 that opened our eyes to the importance of Husserl. And any educated person in Europe who was alive in this period from 1910 to 1940 would have been familiar with Husserl's ideas. And they're important for us. Well, I can just mention one or two. First of all, the call to go back and look at the Cartesian workers, we call them Cartesian, but in any event, the people working in France, the philosophers who were writing the Grammaire raisonnée, the call that Chomsky gave, for example, in the late 1960s, both in his book Cartesian Linguistics and in the more widely read Language and Mind, that call that Chomsky makes during this period basically was a repeat of the call that Husserl made earlier in the century, in the first decade of the 20th century. And I don't think that they're unrelated, although Chomsky doesn't cite Husserl, and I have no reason to think that he actually read Husserl. I equally strongly suspect that Chomsky was pointed in the direction of the Grammaire raisonnée by Roman Jakobson, or potentially by some other European who was familiar with what cultured and educated Europeans knew about. And Husserl explains the importance of going back to a Grammaire raisonnée, a kind of a rational grammar, to better understand the structure and the grammar of natural language. There are other important things that Husserl talks about that involve the notion of logic that'll play a role in our developing understanding of natural language. And there's other aspects of Husserl's work in his capacity as a student of Brentano that play a role, and we talk about this in this chapter. So those are some of the important points that we talk about in the chapter on philosophy from 1900 to 1940. Chapter 8 involves the development of mathematical logic in the first several decades of the 20th century. I'm not going to say too much about it here because I talk about this in the two other videos that I mentioned that I put up on YouTube recently on the origins of generative grammar. But the important point to focus on is that when we look at the origins of generative grammar, what we see is a call on Chomsky's part to develop a kind of grammar that in no way brings into the picture the subjectivity of the grammarian or of the linguist. For Chomsky, generative grammar, its essential part is that all statements made by such a grammar are statements that can be expressed as an algorithm and that require no insight on the part of the linguist in understanding what the claims are that are made. You could say the same way in which a computer program is written, in that way the grammarian has to make explicit their hypotheses or their claims about language. In no way is the subjectivity of the linguist, in no way does that play a role in the grammar or universal grammar that the linguist proposes as his scientific hypothesis. And this way of thinking about science is rooted in ideas about mathematics that were developed in the context of Vienna, the Vienna Circle, the work of David Hilbert, the work of Kurt Gödel, and others. So that's what we talk about in this chapter. Chapter 9 is the last substantive chapter of Battle in the Minefields. There is a chapter 10. It's a short chapter that presents some conclusions that we have drawn over the course of the chapters of the book. Chapter 9 is about the lives and the work of Nikolai Trubetskoy and Roman Jakobson, who basically created European structuralism as we understand it today. The term structuralism in this context is one that Jakobson proposed at the very end of the 1920s. So in this chapter we tell the story both of the Moscow Linguistic Circle and then later the Prague Linguistic Circle. I thought as a working phonologist that I knew a good deal about this material, but boy was I wrong. And not being a reader or speaker of Russian was a serious impediment. Fortunately, over the last couple of decades, Patrick Seriot, who's a historian of linguistics at the Université de Lausanne in Switzerland, has translated a great deal of this work into French, and so people who read French have access to this material now. The lives of Trubetskoy and Jakobson after they left the Soviet Union, Trubetskoy in 1917, Jakobson in 1920, their lives up until the end of their European period, at the very end of the 1930s, plays an important role in the development of their ideas. Their ideas about society, their ideas about politics, their ideas about philosophy, and the impact of the work of Edmund Husserl, for example, and others that he influenced. These are notions these are facts that play an important role that we had no idea about. For that matter, the the relationship between the work that was being done in Gestalt psychology and the ideas of Nikolai Trubetskoy. That too was something we knew nothing about. And although I didn't say too much about Gestalt psychology a few minutes ago when I brought it up, I have to say that we didn't even understand that there was more than one wing of Gestalt psychology during the 1920s and 1930s. The Gestalt psychology that most Americans know is the Gestalt psychology of the Berlin School. But there was also a Vienna school, which did not emerge in the United States after the rise of Nazism, and so we know much less about it. But one of the leading workers in that branch of Gestalt psychology, one of the leaders in this was Karl Bühler, and his ideas had a significant impact on the work of Nikolai Trubetskoy. So if you're at all interested in the rise of structuralism or how European structuralism had an impact on Morris Halle and generative phonology, you have to read this chapter. Well, there we are. That's my summary of the chapters of Battle in the Minefields that I wrote with Bernard Lax. There's a lot of content that I haven't been able to go into in this particular video that I will go into a little more deeply in some other videos. I have already referred to a video that I did that involves a relationship between the Vienna Circle, logical positivism, and mathematical logic, and early generative grammar, and I'll be posting some more. I think that you can see, if you're at all interested in how we got to where we are today in generative grammar, and for that matter more generally in the cognitive sciences, you have a lot to think about and to chew on if you read our book. So I strongly encourage you to take the opportunity to read our book, and obviously I'd be very happy to get feedback and thoughts from any of you after you've read the book.